Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Kulamadail, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the book Decolonisation, Anti-Racism and Legal Pedagogy. It's a great pleasure to have with us today Foluke Adebisi and Ntina Tzouvala, the editors of the volume, who agreed to launch their book with us. It just got published with Routledge. So before we begin, if I could ask those of you in the audience who can and are willing to turn on their cameras, just so that our panelists don't have to speak to black squares. That's always appreciated. Of course, we also understand that some of you can't, but if you can, please do. And without any further ado, I will hand over to the both of you, Foluke and Ntina.
Hi everyone, good to see you. I also want to add that there is a third co-editor, Dr. Soraya Jivraj, that due to urgent personal circumstances could not make it today, but yes, she was an indispensable part of the project, and here is the book. And of course, I want to thank Liz and I want to thank Sylvia for putting together what is the first discussion about this book, and to say how happy I am that we're getting to do this, even though we're doing it online, even though it is in a sense par for the course, because that is a project that was completed entirely online. And paradoxically enough, I only have met Soraya in person after finishing the volume, and I think, as far as I can remember, I have never met Foluke actually in person. So I think it also speaks the way that we carried out this project. Speaks to, the new modalities of collaboration that we are facing as researchers. And again, they might not be always what we would want it to be. But it does, I have to acknowledge that new technologies have in a sense enabled to carry out collaborative projects with people whose work, in my case at least, with people whose work I've known and I respected for a very, very long time, even, through closed borders during COVID and through budgetary restrictions since the end of COVID and things like that. So that was one, and it's, in my view, it is a little bit part of the background, and Foluke will speak more to, for example, the workshops that we held nevertheless. But to me, it is an essential part of the background. So for me, at least, the background of the story is that I had sworn to myself that, and to others for that matter, that I would never, ever edit a book again. Not because I had had bad experiences, but because I thought that it was too much work. And I still believe that it is too much work. But when Foluke and Soraya contacted me and asked me, whether I wanted to come on board for this project, it was very difficult to say no. And I'm eventually very glad that I didn't say no. And the idea behind this book, there is a number actually of ideas behind this book. One of the ideas behind this book was that the experience of all three had been that we are very committed teachers of law, but also in different ways and to different degrees, we also, all of us, have either, in my case, dipped my toes, or in Feluke's case, gone full into doing research about teaching as well, right? And that was, I think, a big part of this project, of wanting to bring together people and also to show to colleagues that research about legal pedagogy is very serious, is a very serious thing. And I think, and if any of the contributors are here, I want to, apologize to them. We showed that by going through sometimes an inordinate number of review rounds. But I think, and that wasn't all the chapters were lovely, but that was partly because I think all of us have a very deep commitment to showing that research about teaching is very serious, but also teaching is very serious. And of course, the other aspect, this is not simply a book about legal pedagogy, this is also a book about decolonization and anti-racism. And it is a book also about the points in which decolonization and anti-racism converge, and I'm going to get into more of these in a minute, but they're also about the points in which they diverge, right? They're also about the differences about those two concepts and about those two pedagogical goals, if we think about them as such. And we could not settle on a title for this book until very, very late, because partly we do have, or we agree that both things are desirable pedagogical goals, but we didn't necessarily agree on every single detail of the relationship. And in a sense, the title is a way of hedging around these, right? Or if I wanted to be less cheeky, of creating an umbrella that can actually contain not an indefinite number of conceptualization, but definitely the conceptualization of the three of us, and also, I would hope so, of most, or if not all, of the book contributors. So I'll stop here, and I think I'll hand it over to Foluke before saying a bit more about the intro.
Thank you, Ntina. I just want to echo everything that Ntina has said, especially thanks to both Liz and Sylvia for setting this up. It's really, edifying after all these online meetings to actually be talking to other people about the book. I also want to, even though she's not here, extend a special recognition to Soraya Jivraj. She was absolutely instrumental, fundamental to the production of this, a very organized person, and that was really helpful to putting this all together, as we'll explain how big of a project it turned out to be. And finally, I want to say thank you to all the contributors, because they engaged. And going back to what Ntina was saying about editing, it's a thankless job most of the time, and it is a lot of work, but the engagement of the contributors on this was absolutely vital for us to find it a useful, beneficial, collaborative, generative experience, but also to be able to finish it in time. The time which we spent compared to other editing jobs that I have done, this went as smoothly as could possibly go, considering it was during a pandemic. So the background of the project. So Soraya and myself, and as Ntina has said, we haven't met in person yet, but fingers crossed, I'm coming to Australia. But Soraya and myself, because Soraya's been doing quite a lot of work around decolonization, and so I'd heard about her work, and we then met at a conference that I organized, and so we had collaborated once or twice. So there's a sort of another edited collection which she contributes to, but I am editing, coming out later this year. So we had a chapter that we wrote together. We're doing various things in the UK together, because we both work within this overlap between decolonization, anti-racism, and pedagogy in law schools. So we were invited to contribute to this series with Routledge to talk about decolonization and legal pedagogy. And we really wanted to make it quite, we didn't want to focus just on the UK, because we felt that was not a useful focus. And the first name that came to our minds was Ntina, and she responded very quickly. So this is the first time hearing that she had any misgivings about it. She responded really quickly and said, "Yes, definitely, I'll do this." And Ntina has been the intellectual sort of strength you bring to this project, I think, is absolutely valuable. So we came up with a call for papers in 2021. So the call for papers went out in 2021, and the book was published in November 2023. So call for papers March 2021, book came out in November 2023. So that's for these sorts of things, a very quick turnaround. We sent the call for papers around certain places, particular places, and to our great surprise, we had 60 really strong abstracts, over 60 really strong abstracts. It was a really difficult task to try and winnow them down. And I have absolutely forgotten, and this is woeful of me, we had a fourth co-editor at the time, Penny Andrews, who's at the New York Law School. Unfortunately, had to drop out due to personal reasons, but she was on board up until the winnowing of the abstracts. And that was a really difficult thing to do. And we were tempted to actually have 2 volumes because they were all so strong. But we just didn't have the strength to have 2 volumes. So what you see is the distillation from over 60 abstracts, and the abstracts were from all over the world, from every inhabited continent, essentially, apart from is it Antarctica? Never remember which one it is. So it was there was a massive amount of interest, which I think is an important thing to note in this area. And this has been my experience, doing call for papers for anything to do with decolonization, is that people are hungry to contribute. And so that was really, really edifying that lots of people wanted to contribute. We accepted 22 of those over 60. I think there were actually 62 abstracts, and we accepted 22 of those, and 16 got published because people had to drop out for various reasons along the line. And just to know, so we had altogether, I think we've had 5 co-editors. Myself and Ntina and Tzouvala have remained until the very end. But that has been itself a really interesting shared experience across the board. The co-editing including with the editors who had to drop out. And so I'm going to hand over to Ntina to talk to the next 2 slides.
Fantastic, thank you. So as we have already alluded to, we wanted to hold together the ideas of decolonization and the ideas of anti-racism, but at the same time, we didn't want to pretend that they mean the same thing or that there are no tensions necessarily between the 2 terms, right? They might, and in a sense, one of the things we want to show is that these 2 goals or concepts or whatever you want to call them, they can work together as part of legal pedagogy, but one needs a significant amount of intellectual work and also, I would say, political work to figure out how the 2 things can work together. And in doing so, one of our main concerns, and I would say that was especially a concern given the locations from which many of our authors were writing. So I would say many of our authors have deep relationships to the global south, but they have ended up teaching mostly in institutions of the global north. One of the things we were very conscious about is, on the one hand, acknowledging this fact, right, and acknowledging that this is a real limitation of the project. And at the same time, not letting these become a way of also reproducing the hubris, especially of neoliberal institutions of the global north, in centering their own understandings of what especially decolonization is. And some of these efforts to decenter the global north take place in the introduction that all three of us co-authored for the book. And one of the things we tried to do, and it is obvious also in the images that you see, is to situate. You could write a history of decolonization and legal pedagogy in many different registers, right? And they would be defensible, more or less. We chose two particular registers, one that is temporarily more recent, and that is, of course, the University of Cape Town protests on Roads Must Fall, and in particular emphasizing the fact that very soon these protests in South Africa morphed into a broader movement of decolonizing higher education that questioned much more than symbols. It became a fees must fall campaign. So that was the first effort to center the history of the global South as leaders of the decolonization in higher education. And the second, more historically distant, and I would say perhaps slightly more forgotten effort, is discussions and struggles that took place in law schools in post-colonial states, and in particular we focused on East African states right after decolonization, about the purpose of legal education in a very literal post-colonial setting, right? And to me, what was really interesting about reading both first-hand accounts, but also secondary literature about it is, of course, many things were different, but many things that concerned those colleagues were very similar to the things that concerned us, right? So a tension that you see emerging time and again in many post-colonial law schools is the tension between creating job-ready, practically trained lawyers on the one hand, and the imperatives, let's say, of a more humanistic education on the other. And of course, there's important differences between our moment and theirs, in the sense that at that moment, those advocating for a more practical education didn't have in mind generally commercial law firms. They had in mind people who would work in law and development, for example, projects. But nevertheless, that is a tension that we experience today as well, right? And very often, due to not inherent incompatibility, but due to time restrictions, we do have to make choices about whether we will offer to our students a more rounded and theoretically grounded critique of coloniality or racism, or whether we will make them, good lawyers who can, get bail for their clients, right? Sometimes this is a real dilemma due to time constraints and resource constraints, right? So to me, it was really interesting to see a similar concern emerging. And another concern emerging, there was, I think, a number of concerns that felt familiar, but another concern is, if one reads about the rise and fall of Dar es Salaam Law School as a radical post-colonial law school, for me, the thing that pops out is that its fall was not due to the futility of the project or any sort of intellectual inadequacy. There was no such thing. Therefore, and that is documented very well by colleagues who were there at the time, was because basically due to IMF structural adjustments, these law schools were systematically starved out of funds, right? So student to staff ratio worsened, libraries stopped being renewed, colleagues became overwhelmed with teaching and administrative duties. And again, unfortunately, of course, with important differences. But one thing that we wanted to draw out was that this is an intellectual project, and we think it is worthy as an intellectual project, but it rests on material resources, right? And its success relies not only on the coherence and value and persuasiveness of the ideas that are here, but it also relies on the job prospects and the work conditions and the stability of the people who wrote here, but also for the people that we are teaching. So in a sense, we wanted to avoid, and we try to do this especially in the introduction, let's say in the philosophical terms, an overtly idealist idea of what decolonization is, and how it can be achieved. And that brings me to my final point, which is, of course, I think if all three of us spoke in detail about what we understand as decolonization, there would be differences, but I think they are also important agreements, right? And one of the things that I think we furiously agree with each other is a distrust towards the way that global North, especially universities, have understood decolonization to be basically perfectly synonymous with diversity and inclusion, right? That decolonization is if we get more racialized people on our faculty lists and our student lists and judges and lawyers, etc. None of us is rejecting these as very worthy goals. I do think that, and I think we all three agree, that the inclusion is a worthy goal as long as the structures remain the same. But at the same time, we all agree that decolonization does fundamentally require a fundamental rethinking, both of our legal pedagogy approaches and of the content of what we're teaching. And a typical example here would be taken, for example, from my context in Australia, that teaching law as if the state is the only source of law in Australia is to perpetuate colonialism, right? Is to redo a move that has been done repeatedly in this continent since 1788, which is to negate the lawfulness and continued existence as law of Indigenous legal systems, right? So the idea here is, of course, you can engage with Australian law and challenge it and make it more inclusive, but any move that treats it as the only law perpetuates the colonial moment. And I think that's also an example of the not automatic compatibility between decolonization and anti-racism, right? Because again, thinking from a settler colonial context, very often, even the most radical anti-racist projects can be projects that legitimize the settler colonial project, right? It's a project in which everyone will become equal in the settler dispossessive project, right? So that is, in a sense, one of the things we wanted to push back against. And the other thing we want to push back against is the appropriation of decolonization agendas in rhetoric and pedagogy by reactionary projects in the global South, right? So the typical example here would be the way that Hindu nationalists in India are claiming the mantle of decolonization to enact a deeply Islamophobic agenda. And we think that also this is not in general a political objection. I think this is also a legal pedagogy objection, which is we need to think about ways of teaching this multiplicity of legal systems. So, for example, indigenous legal systems, as I alluded to earlier, or religious legal systems, without refining them and without implying that these legal systems represent some sort of eternal essence of this or that people, right? We have to show, if we are really committed to a progressive decolonization agenda, to show this legal system as battlegrounds in their own right? As non-reified legal living systems that competent lawyers from within can use to advance different projects. And for example, they can be used in ways that are feminist. They can be used in ways that push back against, let's say, all forms of queer phobia coming out of this sort of reactionary decolonization. So that was the one thing I think we all agree in. We might not agree on everything, but saving decolonization on the one hand from the neoliberal managerial, like sort of multicultural neoliberalism on the one hand, and from reactionary third, like global south project on the other, was something that is, I think, very central to our thinking, and I think is very central to a number of the chapters of this book. Foluke, can I ask you to move to the next slide? Thank you. And these goals were very much reflected on the prompts, in a sense, of the tasks that we gave each and every one of us. So one of the things we asked our authors, and actually we encouraged dissent, we encouraged people to tell us what does decolonization and on anti-racism means for them, and we encouraged to make this clear and explicit, especially when we thought there was a disagreement either with either chapters or with what we thought that it was, right? And it was also really, I think it was a very interesting intellectual exercise for me and hopefully for others to actually having to nail down, what am I talking really about anti-racism here, or am I talking about decolonization, or am I talking about where the two converge? The second aspect that we asked people to do is to think why and how it is relevant to what, where, and how they teach. So I think that was an extremely valuable exercise that hopefully will be helpful to others, which was, we have a combination of more abstract chapters that think about the concept and about law schools in general, but we also have, and Foluke will explain that, a series of chapters that deal, rolling up your sleeves and explaining how you would teach, or how you do teach contracts in the United States from a perspective that centers decolonization and or anti-racism. And that also touches to the third aspect, how you embedded these insights to your work. And fourthly, reflections both about what worked, but also, of course, about what didn't, right? And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed is reading very frank reflections of people about, the trials and errors that led them to where they are. And I think one of the things that I enjoyed, and it comes from a very long line of feminist legal scholars and critical race scholars, is how much people speak and narrate and tell their stories, on the first person, being very frank about their limitations and not, pretending to be speaking from nowhere. I know that I did it in my chapter, and I find it really difficult to do this. I have a very different style of writing, and I do consider this to be perhaps one of the things that I learned and earned from this volume as an author and not as an editor. So all chapters of the volume address more or less these four questions, but they address them in different ratios, so to speak. And I think with that note, I'll give the floor to my co-editor.
Thank you, Ntina. I really enjoyed listening to you, by the way. So to put into practice what Ntina is talking about, that reflection, and I think it's something difficult not only for academics, but specifically for legal academics to put ourselves into the conversation and also to examine our limitations, because I think legal academics, we always think we're all powerful, all knowing, and then we have to write about decolonization and the limits and the struggles that we have had with it. And that was something that I think it was really difficult for us to know as writers and also as editors, how much of that we can put into the writing. So one of the things that we did was that we had a series of writing workshops. As Ntina has already mentioned, even the editorial meetings were all done online. So every single thing was online. We had the first, so Routledge reached out to us in 2020, and as we know, that was the sort of year of the beginning of the global shutdown and the great going online. But we were really trying to have, and as we know with edited collections, anyone who's worked with them, it's really difficult to get a sort of cohesive voice going. And this one particularly was would have been quite difficult because we had contributors from South Africa, India, Canada, Australia, Samoa. So having all of that, and I keep on forgetting the UK, but trying to get a not a singular voice, but at least a voice that looks like we're all in conversation. So we didn't think we had to agree, but we wanted to seem like we were having the same conversation. And one of the more practical problems here was finding a time for those writing workshops. So we had to have different ones because, as we said, someone's writing from Samoa, the other person's writing from Canada. We couldn't even find one single time that will work for both of those. So we had different ones. And I can remember the contributor from Samoa, it was 2 a.m. in the morning. And that was a really difficult conversation for them to be having, but everyone really engaged. And I would, if you were doing an edited collection, I would really suggest that you do joint writing workshops. It's really worked very well for us because it allowed the writers to lean into that reflection. So questions of what people can take away from each chapter, I think that deepened those observations where we would naturally have the tendency to want to write in a way that says, well, this is the problem, this is the solution, and thank you for reading. We were more reflective because of those conversations. So just to give you an overview of the different sections, so we had 4 different sections, and Ntina has, had started describing them. So in the first section, part 1, and this was after the introduction where we tried to sort of reflect on our different positions about the relationship between decolonization and anti-racism in legal pedagogy. The first section contains chapters that were actually trying to critique this decolonizing project in law schools, but from different positions. So one of the chapters was from the UK, another one was from South Africa. And then second section was looking at private law. And I have been to so many universities in the UK to talk about decolonization. And the first question, almost invariably, the first question I get is, well, you can decolonize international law, but you cannot do that to land law or contract or tort. That's impossible. So I was really happy that we had so many chapters. We actually had so many abstracts on that question. It was almost like people were hungry to write about this thing that people were telling them was impossible. So there's a really good section. And one of the things I like about the private law section also is that it's quite diverse in the different places where they're writing from. So there's writing from India, Ireland, the US, Australia. So it's quite diverse. And then we had the public law section, which included, more public aspects of law. And I found that that particular section really interesting, apart from the variety of it, but the way in which the contributors are questioning the authority of law, I found really, really interesting. And then the final section was the social legal section. So I'm just going to pick out a couple of and describe a couple of chapters across the board. And I found this really difficult trying to pick out which chapters to talk about. And I basically just picked out the, the co-editors and a few others, mainly because I want people to know I haven't picked out the best chapters. I've just picked out the chapters that I can remember the most and that I can talk about really quickly. So the first one I want to talk about, and I'm just going to give a very brief sort of not overview, but the things I found really interesting about what these different contributions were saying. So Phoebe Boateng, Aisha Madza, and Sophia Hayat Taha, I really liked their chapter because they were talking from a student's perspective. So students who had been invited to decolonize the curriculum, and they talked about how that experience sort of demonstrated the cooptational ways of the use of student labor. So university wants to use the student labor to say that they have decolonized their university, but they're not willing to listen to the students or reward their labor, or actually do give up any, not even space. So they wouldn't even meet with the students where they wanted to meet or the times they wanted to meet. So the university seems to be unwilling to give up anything to then declare themselves as decolonized. So trying to use the students as a badge of decolonization without actually wanting to do anything. Another interesting point with this chapter is the relationship between abolition and decolonization. So we talked about the relationship between decolonization and anti-racism, but I also find really interesting that idea of abolition as a way to dream of a sort of forward-looking world. And I just want to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore on this. What the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. So those who feel in their gut deep anxiety that abolition means knock it all down, scorch the earth, and start something new, let that go. Abolition is building the future from the present in all of the ways that we can. And I would say every single chapter illustrates this feeling, this need to build something else. And that I think resonates with my own sort of in my own writing. I don't use the decolonize the curriculum or decolonize the law school articulation. What I say is that we should ask a different question rather than saying, how can we decolonize the law school? We should ask, what does it mean to dream of new anti-colonial worlds from within the walls of the law school? Christy Clark, Sarah Keenan, and John Page give us 3 case studies from Birkbeck in the UK, Canberra, and Southern Cross University. And they are looking at property law and how do you bring these questions of anti-racism, although they focus more on decolonization. How do you bring these questions of decolonization into the teaching of property law? They examine the tensions between indigenizing property law and decolonizing property law. And in a way, it resonates very much with Ntina talked earlier about East Africa and how there were these conversations about decolonizing post-colonial institutions, and a lot of them sort of reflect on similar points. It's a different time, a different space, but those questions, they keep on coming up. Is something decolonization or is it indigenization? And one of the things that sort of really stuck with me from this chapter is the question of possibility, how they urge us, the authors urge us to keep on trying despite the strictures of the programs and the limitations of the structures of our universities, that we need to keep on trying things out. Fadi Louise Boone Kuo and Tanya Mitchell, they talk about the ordinary person test, which is a personal favorite of mine to talk about. They're basing their own conversation in Australia. There are a couple of other chapters that examine the ordinary or the reasonable person test in different jurisdictions. But they use an anti-racist frame, which I find very interesting, while talking about the presumption of race neutrality and how the ordinary person test is deployed in legal education. They also talk about the relationship between indigenization and decolonization, but they're using a slightly different frame, which I find an interesting juxtaposition between those two chapters. And they examine this question through criminal law and trademark law, which I also think is an interesting sort of side-by-side comparison. The other chapter that I want to talk about is written by Ntina Tzouvala, and she's going to blush now. But I really find this one interesting because it's very often the case, and I quite coincidentally had this conversation last week. A lot of people would say international law is one of the easiest to decolonize. And one of the things that Ntina is talking about here is how it isn't, and how there's so many tensions going on, especially with how students engage with the unit and why they engage in the particular ways they engage. So I find this a very reflective piece. And also the question of whether we can say we have decolonized a unit. So I think a lot of people who start in this journey will start by saying, all right, I'm going to decolonize my unit. But if they're engaging in a committed and honest way, they get to, a particular stage in the journey and they recognize that they cannot decolonize international law or the law of contract or land law within a system, within a neoliberal university, especially fee-paying universities where, for example, you're trying to decolonize land law, but the jurisdiction in which you live still uses land as sort of a major source of wealth. That's not decolonizing land law. And finally, and I'm going to blush myself now, the only reason I have chosen this, so this chapter, we're not talking to myself and Yvette Russell. We're not talking about taking a decolonizing or anti-racist approach to a particular pre-existing unit, a standard unit, but actually how do you take that approach to develop a new unit? And that's the only chapter that really talks about that. The aim of the unit that we developed called Law and Race, it aims to examine law through the eyes of race. So race, in this case, understood as a product of the colonial, imperial, and racializing legal ideas that continue to underpin our world. And in that sense, if you are doing this properly, it's not diversity. The other problem that we mention here is that we have a problem of limited material when you're developing a new unit in this sort of situation. But again, like the preceding chapters, it's a hopeful reflection that we have, even though there are lots of limitations and we don't think we have decolonized the law school or even the unit that we are teaching. So which brings me to my reflections. I'll say a few reflections and leave the rest to Ntina. As we have said, because I think we have mentioned quite a number of those reflections. For me personally, this was a very, very beneficial process. I learned so much about different jurisdictions, but also just about how we go on doing things when things are hard, when there's pushback, when we're trying to figure stuff out, how much kinder we should be to ourselves about the limitations that we face, but also having courage when it's difficult to speak out. The fact that we couldn't do 2 volumes also speaks to the problems of trying to do this where the work conditions are so bad. Uh, if say for example I was teaching 1 unit, 1 class per day, then I will happily do 5. I'd happily do 5 volumes and keep on doing them until we run out of things to say, which I would say in the current state of the world that would be impossible. And so there's always that tension, I think, when we're engaging in this area of decolonization and legal pedagogy, that we're trying to burn the candle at both ends, essentially. We're trying to do the work that the university wants us to do, that keeps us in a job, that keeps us paid, while we're trying to speak against the university and try and re-envision the university, but using the structures that the university has told us we need to use for promotion and career progression, writing edited volumes. And I think that is and like I said, this is a really beneficial project, and I do hope everyone goes out to read it. But the fact that we're writing books is in English is also a limitation of the project. And I'll hand over to Ntina for more reflections.
Thank you. That was really interesting to hear. It's the first time I hear you talking about the book. So that was, I thought, very valuable. So the final reflection I have, and I will not take too much more of your time, is I think partly by design, but partly unintentionally, we ended up trying to hold together two things that are not nominally incompatible, but they're definitely in tension. So partly we try to be ruthlessly practical, right? So we try to just say we don't want to write one more abstract reflection on law and coloniality or on law and decolonization. We want to give colleagues who will read the book very practical how-to guide, not on how to decolonize, because as Foluke says, we agree that that's not possible, but how to start doing things towards that direction, right? And that was partly, and we tackled that in the introduction, that ruthless commitment to being practical was because we all felt that modesty is important and realism is important. But it's also important for modesty and realism to not be used as an excuse for inaction, right? It's a very common gesture, and it's a very common gesture, especially by the type of person who will pick up these, to say, oh, this is a structural issue. And by this is a structural issue, they mean, and therefore I don't have to try to do anything. I don't disagree that this is a structural issue, but at the same time, we were very committed to giving to those who care the tools to do something where they are at the moment that they encounter the book, of course with humility and not with a lawyerly problem-solving mentality. So that was the one thing, right? And we were also very committed to giving everyone, wherever they find themselves in this divide of coloniality, of racism, the tools to do so, right? Because one of our concerns is it is just a matter of fact that law schools are dominated either by white folks in white majority places or in other places by people who belong in the dominant demographic. And we want this to change, but at the same time, we cannot wait for this to change until we do something, right? So for your white colleagues who are like, oh, I want to do something, but I don't know, I'm afraid I might do the wrong thing. I think what we are trying to say is, of course you will do the wrong thing, not because of your identity, but because it's impossible to do exactly the right thing. Of course you will do the wrong thing, but that is not a justification to not do something, right? And of course, with being reflective and in conversation with others and in conversation with those who are most affected. So on the one hand, we're holding this ruthless pragmatism, and on the other hand, we are holding a more theoretical, but also I would say, as Foluke alluded to, a more utopian outlook, right? An idea that there is more to decolonization and anti-racism than the particular solutions that I think we could and should implement, right? That there is something that is always in excess of these very practical suggestions, and we think that this is good and valuable, and it is also worth holding on to, and especially that's why I thought it was very valuable including chapters such as the one that Foluke mentioned that was like, it just the law school needs to be abolished, right? And it's not practical and it's not going to happen, but that's not the point, right? The point is to hold on to the idea that perhaps burning it down is the only solution. But in the meanwhile, maybe go through your reading lists. So that's my perhaps closing comment.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Ntina. Yeah.
No, thanks to the both of you, Foluke and Dina. You've put so much on the table, and I don't even know where to start. I also really appreciated that you gave us an insight into the editorial process and the struggles and challenges that you faced, and also just helped us to make sense of this project. So now we are at the Q&A, which is when I hope that everyone in the black squares will will come on, and you are really warmly invited to ask questions. From previous book launches, I know that some people are hesitant because they have not read the book, but a launch is precisely the point to give you a possibility to actually, just ask without having had to read it first. So while some of you warm up, let me just exercise the privilege as moderator to get us started. So for one, I loved hearing the difficulties or the discussions that you had in just weighing questions of diversity within law schools with a decolonial agenda and the co-optation of the decolonial agenda by reactionary movements. And I don't think that is just limited to the global south. I think that's also very, very clear in the global north. So nonetheless, I coming from context of Germany, Switzerland, where law schools are still very, very white and very, very male, it sometimes feels difficult not to not to also call for a little bit of diversification. However, of course, we are also aware with the limits. So I'm just wondering what you would basically advise, not just actually to early career faculty, but also to administrators, which may have all of the best intentions, for all we know, to not fall into this trap. And then along the same lines, so something that I've noticed a lot is an anxiety among some students when it comes to decolonial teaching and the expectations they think they will face in the job market. So pushback from the student body when being exposed to too much decolonial material, sometimes at the expense of sort of more practice-oriented teaching. And I was just wondering if you have some experience, well, some words of wisdom for us with that. And then finally, as Dina knows, some of my research interest is really ableism, and that goes very much to the heart of the neoliberal university as an institution which is so much geared towards really pleasing to capitalist labor markets and maximizing output of each academic. So just again, how do we square this with the decolonial agenda? And I see there's some hands up, so I'm just wondering if you want to answer questions now or if I should collect some more.
Shall we answer yours because there were quite a few, and then we can collect the questions of a couple of people? Is that okay? Because it's getting late here and I'll start forgetting them.
Sure.
Foluke, do you want to go first?
I'll try. It's not late here, but I'm also forgetting things. I think it's just been a long academic term for me. So thank you for those questions, Liz, and then I'll probably hand over to Ntina to answer some of them. So I think the first question was around sorry. So what was the first question? Just give me one word.
The first question was basically how to, in universities in the global north, how to square sort of what is still very, very white, very, very male law schools with diversification without falling into the reactionary agenda of legitimizing the existing structures.
Yeah, I remember now. Thank you, Liz. I don't know, considering the history of how not just the term, but the project of decolonization has moved around the world. I don't know that it is possible to not fall into the reactionary agenda. And I think it's always dangerous to be focused on trying to fight against something rather than trying to fight for something. To go back to that, some almost the idealistic visionary future that we're trying to build. I think it's Toni Morrison that says racism is a distraction. And a lot of times we spend too much time, for example, trying to debate the contribution of certain people to humanity. And to be honest, life is too short. And I think that we need to be quite definite about which conversations we want to have and which conversations we don't want to be having. So that's sort of like a hard boundary, right? But I do think it's useful, especially as legal academics, to keep on trying to clarify what we mean by decolonization. And I think there's a little bit too much of decolonize X, in which situation a lot of academics who are in this conversation haven't unpacked what decolonization means, and then they just throw in this unpacked word at something. So the example I often give is I went to a conference once, it was a pedagogy conference, and they said they were looking to decolonize assessment. And yeah, because I basically flew out of my chair had nothing to say, but I was like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And so I think for books such as, edited collections such as ours, or anyone writing in decolonization in this area, it's an intellectual thing, right? So we need to approach it like intellectuals. What does it mean to us? And that's why it was a really important part of sort of what we asked contributors to do. What does decolonization mean to you as a legal academic in the time and space in which you are being a legal academic? And so don't just throw it at, the law of contract or land law or jurisprudence. What is that word and why is it relevant to that thing? And we think that being completely intellectual about this endeavor, this project, is a useful way forward. And on the question of students and their possible pushback, I think we encounter that, and I think Ntina also mentions this in her chapter as well, where students question, what is the use of this to my sort of future contribution to the workforce, which I think in itself is a question that has to be unpacked. And what I just have tended to do now is to use my old unit evaluation forms and send it to new students, because all the students say, and it's across the board, they say, I understand the world better now. And you understand the world better, you become a better member of the workforce. You contribute to building a better world. That's been my approach now. But before you get unit evaluation forms, I think having a conversation as to what these endeavors are meant to do may be useful. And I think I'll hand over to Ntina so I don't hog all the questions.
Fantastic, thank you. This was really good answers. So I agree a lot with the not arguing, as in I have kind of stopped, or at least I try very often to be like, I don't need to explain to you why our faculty can not only have one demographic of people, you have to make the case about why it has to have one demographic of people. That's a bizarre thing to believe, and you have to explain it. But yeah, so that's the one thing. The second thing is, I'm a big fan of walking and chewing gum, but also knowing that walking is a different thing to chewing gum. So that I think there is very good reasons to advocate for faculties to reflect the diversity of humanity. I don't think reflecting this diversity of humanity will automatically result to any sort of decolonization, but I think it's nevertheless a worthy goal. If anything, I would say it's not even a worthy goal, it's just an obvious thing, and those who oppose it need to explain why they systematically end up not doing it, right? So that is the one thing. And it's a little bit, I know I'm a little bit cranky about it. It's late, but secondly, I'm just cranky about it because it's a bizarre situation to find ourselves into. The thing about the practicalities, I have a lot of understanding for students who say this, and I think we need to start from a position of compassion. We need to start from a position of compassion, perhaps less so in Germany, but like in the UK and in Australia, we are burdening them with incredible debt, right? I know that in Germany it's slightly different, for example, because of free higher education. And I think that if I had this debt when I was in my early 20s, I would want to become a commercial lawyer. I wouldn't want to become a wacky academic, right? So I think we need to start from a position of compassion and understanding that not all of them are saying that because they have bad politics. The second place of compassion is the students that are pushed the harder to become good technical lawyers is the students whose political beliefs I share and who come from marginalized backgrounds, because I'm like, you need it. You need it in life, but also you will need it in the law firm because you don't have the privileges that others do. So sometimes it's the ones that I'm like, I'm really sorry, but you have to really become a very good technical lawyer. And then, so these are the two positions of compassion. And the third thing I think is what Foluke said about not making verbally the case necessarily, but showing to them that in international law, let's say, sorry for those who are not international lawyers, I genuinely think that the laws of state responsibility make no sense. Like they are literally nonsensical until you understand the particular struggles, especially about investment in Latin America, basically, that gave rise to some of these rules. Like they don't make sense. If you try to understand them by using the rules of deduction, you will go insane sooner than later. And I'm sure there's other examples in other legal fields. The fourth thing is, when Gramsci was in prison, he was writing the prison notebooks. The prison notebooks are a little bit unreadable because he didn't say Marxism. He didn't even say historical materialism. He said something like the history of science, and it meant Marxism. Point being, maybe, and that was the only way the prison notebooks made it out of the prison. Point being, for people who are in very conservative institutions, either in terms of colleagues or in terms of students, and or for people who are in precarious working conditions, I wouldn't call it decolonial. I wouldn't call it anything, probably. I would just teach them the stuff with assigning probably relatively mainstream readings, and I would introduce in a gentle way in judging the situation, the insights, and you don't need to call them decolonial. You don't need to call them feminist. You don't need to call them twale, whatever in international law. Now, that will not always work. Sometimes people will call you, but I think sometimes it will. Sometimes it will allow you to claim, in a sense, the center and to claim the middle ground in a way that going in guns blazing will not. So I do think that there is a case to be made for not necessarily naming things because people freak out. Students freak out. I think in our research we should name things, but I think there is a case to be made about teaching to be more subtle in the way we approach these questions.
Wonderful. So now we have two hands up. I think first it was Daniel and then Sue.
Wonderful. I hope you can hear me well, and it's nice to see a couple of familiar and new faces. I was just reminded this of the time we were in Budapest for this decolonizing university school, which was a wonderful experience, but it had some trouble precisely because I think they didn't really think, as the editors of the book are thinking, that decolonizing is something that requires a lot of work. And I think that one of the kind of challenges that I had in that summer school was that I thought that there was kind of a lack of, let's say, engagement with the tensions that inhabit the anti-colonial coalition, so to say. And it seems to me it would be useful to kind of disentangle a little bit what a post-colonial approach to university or the law school or whatever might mean from a more decolonial approach or from what a subaltern approach. So I guess that would be my first question to the editors. How do you position yourself in this kind of nuances within the anti-colonial tradition? And how do you think it's useful or not, maybe something strategically, to embrace those differences, not only our commonalities? And I guess the second question, just very briefly, and I think Tina already said some very interesting things about that, but I just wonder if you can say more about what your book tells us that is distinctive about the British Empire. Because I think this is fascinating of the book project. It's really about the British Empire in its broadest sense. So I was wondering, is something that we can take from that? What do you think that is distinctive, for instance, in terms of depth, in terms of legal education of the British Empire writ large, compared to other sorts of imperial formations? Thank you.
Yes, Sue, go ahead.
It was lovely listening to you, and I'm really excited to delve into the book. And I think we can all learn a lot from the approach you just detailed that you took during the editorial process. I also have two questions, unfortunately. The one concerns a bit more the question of speaking from the center that you just mentioned, Dina. It's something that I kept thinking while you were presenting the book. And talking about this tension between educating competent lawyers and fostering this critical position. And I don't know if you agree, but I think to a certain extent, being a good and a competent lawyer means pretending not to see all these things, speaking from the center, speaking from a place of neutrality. So how do you address that in the book? That would be the first thing. And the second thing, also, like, coming from Germany, where examinations and this very rigid state examination is a big part of what stifles critical pedagogy. I was wondering if, like, Foluke Adebisi, what you were talking about, how decolonizing assessment doesn't make any sense, and I agree, but how do these kinds of barriers enter the vision of the book and its content? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel and Sue, for your question. So I think Daniel's first question was, so how do we position ourselves in this decolonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial, subaltern? And so I'm speaking from a personal point of view. And so if you read the chapter that I co-wrote, there's a short intellectual history of my own journey through all of these, which is also examined a little bit in my monograph that was published last year. And I think I started out post-colonial from a very almost laid back examination of, so what's the effect of colonization on things, and then move to decolonial. I'm probably at anti-colonial now. So I don't necessarily think that there's a spectrum that you move from post-colonial to decolonial to anti-colonial, but I think there's a usefulness in examining all of those. And I would say for the contributors to the volume, there is that also trying to figure out where everyone sits, and especially in the context of their own geographies. And I think that's particularly interesting in North America. So the contributions we have from North America, because I think there's a bit of a distinction in North America between how there's an engagement with decolonization from an indigenous point of view, and then you find a more sort of CRT lean, abolition lean. And I don't, as I mentioned when I was talking about the first chapter in the book, I don't necessarily see these things as separate. I see them as connected bodies of thought and different ways to move between temporalities and spatialities, essentially. So for the unit that I teach, Law and Race, we talk about all of these approaches. So decolonial, subaltern studies, we talk about post-colonial and anti-colonial. And it's then I leave it to students to then locate themselves between all of these. And I think it, for me, sits in this idea of pluriversality, is the idea that, you know, we want a world in which many worlds fit. And because we've got different experiences and different backgrounds, I think the way in which we would locate ourselves within trying to understand the world would necessarily not always be exactly the same. I don't necessarily think, and Ntina may have further thoughts on this, but I don't necessarily think that what then comes out from the book is that there's a distinctiveness about the British Empire. I think what actually comes out of it is the different ways in which the British Empire, even within itself, is not their point of departure. So we've got writing from Australia, for example, South Africa, Ireland, India. And they're all talking about the different ways, and these ways are not exactly the same, in which this engagement or this imposition of colonial ways of thinking, being, and doing have produced certain ways of being, you know, within the law. And I find that in itself really interesting, because we're, you know, that's just the British Empire, and it would have been interesting to juxtapose that, I think, with the French, Portuguese, Spanish, and German empires. And that's again one of the limitations, that we were unable to do that. If we do have strength and time, maybe we'll do that in the second, third, or fourth volume. And that's speaking from the center. So to go to Sue's question, that so that's a question that always comes up, and is something, and it is, I think, similar to one of Liz's questions about, you know, students and how we engage students with this question of decolonization and anti-racism. And I think that also touches upon, because we often have this conversation when we're introducing decolonization, whether we name it or not, as Ntina is saying, where do we put it? Because it's very often the case, my experience has been that it's put in optional units at the end of standard units, because the presumption is we need to teach lawyers to be good and competent, and then we add all this sort of kumbaya stuff. But I think it's the opposite. We're actually not teaching them to understand the world. The feedback, the almost consistent feedback I get from my students since I've started teaching these sorts of things in the curriculum is that they understand the world better. And I think both of those things are not separate. It's, you know, the one thing I always tell my students before they sign on to the unit is that this is an absolutely rigorous course. We're not going to sit down and complain about how horrible the law is or how horrible the world is and how, you know, discrimination is a bad thing. That's not, you know, what I want them to do at all. I want them to be able to read across different types of literature, to be able to unpack these things in really rigorous ways. And so I am, you know, my hope is that we are training them to actually to understand complexities and tensions and all these different overlapping strategies, but also taking all of that and helping them to go back to what Ntina says, understand the things that don't make sense, because these things all make sense if we put them in the context that they're meant to be. Why is it that despite, all the things that, all the progress that we seem to have made, racial injustice continues to repeat, continues to be reproduced? When we then unpack all of these with the students, they go, well, it makes absolute sense to us. And they can then foresee where the problems will be coming from because they have done the reading, they've understood those things. And I think that is an important thing to almost telegraph, not just to students, but to those who are worried that this introducing anti-racist decolonial stuff makes curricula less rigorous. I think it actually makes it much more rigorous, but people don't often think so, and for various reasons. This is not just because people are being mean. There are some sort of reasonable reasons why they believe that that's the case. One of the questions I often ask myself, to go back to the question of can we decolonize assessment, is if we were building a law school now, so if we, because Ntina was talking about that first chapter that says abolish the law school. So if we completely dismantled everything and we were building something new now without any need for it to be connected with what has come before, I don't think we'll be doing the assessments that we're doing now. But we also will not be doing the sort of teaching structures that we have now. I always find it really difficult when I'm in a seminar and the conversation is flowing and then it's time to go. So the learning is determined by the amount of time we have rather than the amount of things we need to learn. And so there are lots of structures that impede learning, engagement, that we don't have that much control over. And I think we can continue to question them until they change. And I think, because Ntina was talking about, that what are the practicalities that we can do now, even though we know there's a structural problem? And I think assessments are one of those structural problems that we can question. And as we question, hopefully they change. But I think we can question them, but I would not say that questioning them is decolonizing them. And then I'll hand over to Ntina. I meant to be brief. I apologize.
No, that was fabulous. It gave me time to think and it gave me stuff to think with. So I actually loved the question about the British Empire, and I have been trying to think, because it is true that there is a massive overrepresentation of former British colonies, which I think, to be honest, was mostly the unintended outcome of the composition of the editors rather than a conscious choice. But I think, nevertheless, I agree. So one of the things that comes out is the differences, right? And how the imprint of the British Empire is very different across time and space. Of course, the one thing that is in common is the diffusion of the common law. And I was trying to think, because I'm not a common lawyer by training, I'm a civil lawyer by training. I was trying to think, what can that help us do as legal teachers, right? That perhaps civil law might not. And to me, one of the things is because the common law reasoning type of style tries to latch on facts and try to distinguish, did all these things. It's a useful way, it's a useful heuristic, basically, of trying to get students to think about what context matters and what context doesn't, and what facts are thought to be similar or dissimilar enough from others, and based on what presumptions, right? That this move is doing a lot of work, right? That I think this is happening also in civil law context, but it's a little bit more sublimated. So that's one thing. Paradoxically, the other thing that I think is doing is that, for a number of, again, historically contingent reasons, law schools in many parts of the English-speaking world, not all parts, but many parts, for historically contingent reasons, also having to do with how joining the bar works, they have left a little bit more space for the sort of wacky stuff that we do. It's not much, but I understand it's more than in continental Europe, and I understand that as someone who did do her undergrad in continental Europe. So I think partly one of the strange British Empire results is that many of these law schools, that there is law school is still vocational training, but there's a weird also disconnect between the two, right? Including the fact that in the UK, you don't need to go to the law school to become a barrister or a solicitor, weirdly enough. So that can leave a little bit more space than the state exam does in Germany. And I'll use this to move to your questions. So here's the thing. And again, I'm saying that I'm mostly having my impression from Anglo context. In my anecdotal evidence suggests that actual practicing lawyers tend to have a keen awareness of, they might not call it coloniality or racism or whatever, but they have a good awareness of these contradictions, right, and these tensions. The people who don't have them are more doctrinal or formalist lawyers who teach in law schools rather than necessarily good lawyers. It's just good lawyers, practicing lawyers, have to bracket these things, as would, by the way, every single one of us, if they have to go and get someone bail, right? That's not the exercise. The exercise is just get them bail, get them out of there. So I think like people bracket these things, and I think rightly so, to do particular things with law, but fortunately we don't have to do that. So what I'm trying to say in a sense is, I think it's a particular type of formalism, academic version of formalism, that is the problem rather than practicing lawyers. And that's why, for example, I, as a student, would not have been caught dead doing it, but I do think that there is something weirdly subversive about mooting, just in a sense of teaching students that these are just some arguments. You just have to come up with some arguments. These are not rules. Don't be silly. And I think there is something very subversive, not very subversive, slightly subversive there. I shouldn't exaggerate. So that's the first point. The second point about the state exam and whatever, I do think, in a sense, and Foluke alluded to it, that's the problem with the hegemony of the English language, and therefore English-speaking systems of education within legal research, which is, I acknowledge that there's a good chance that every single thing me and Foluke have said just simply doesn't apply to the German context. I suspect that that's the case, or it applies, but in very highly modified ways. So I do appreciate that. My very brief experience with teaching like one class in Germany, which counts for nothing, is that at the end there was a couple of students who came and were like, oh, we are so happy that you said it, because we have been thinking about it and we didn't have the words for it. There is a question, and I think it's a legitimate question, which is, do you teach for those two students or do you teach again for the center? And I don't think there's exactly a universally correct answer to that.
Great. So I promised Dina not to drag this talk out unnecessarily because it's already very, very late on her end, which is why I would like to conclude by thanking the both of you for the wonderful insights that you gave us into the book, its substance, its editorial process, and just the general reflections. Thank you so much. Your talk also concludes the mini series, the mini book launch series of the Law by Color Code project. However, the book launch series of the Global Governance Center continues. So for those of you interested, on the 23rd of April, my colleague Neha Mishra will launch her book, International Trade Law and Global Data Governance. So thanks everyone for coming, and I hope to see you all soon in one form or another. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.